today, millions of Americans went back to work and to school after taking part this weekend in sweeping historic protests across all 50 states. According to the organizers of the No Kings protests, about 8 million people hit the streets, all protesting the policies of one President Donald Trump. A couple quick numbers for you. If 8 million people participated, that means more than 1 out of every 50 people in America were at a protest Saturday. And according to the organizers, 2/3 of the people who signed up to protest live in the suburbs, small towns, or rural areas. That's a 40% increase from the last No Kings protest. And Americans' anger at Trump is not just showing up in the streets. A new poll from the University of Massachusetts Amherst found Trump's approval at 33%, an all-time low. It all comes as Donald Trump's war in Iran enters its second month. Today, Trump amped up both his optimism for a deal with Iran and his threats against the country if they don't reach a deal. He wrote on social media that the U.S. is in serious discussions with a new and more reasonable regime and that they've made great progress. But if there's no deal, the Strait of Hormuz isn't opened immediately. Trump says the U.S. will destroy their power plants, oil wells, Kharg Island, and possibly water desalination plants. Well, you may be wondering, a new regime in Iran? When did that happen? Well, it didn't. But here's how Trump explained it just last night.
We've had regime change, if you look already, because the one regime was decimated, destroyed, they're all dead. The next regime is mostly dead. And the third regime, we're dealing with different people than anybody's dealt with before. It's a whole different group of people. So I would consider that regime change. And frankly, they've been very reasonable. So I think we've had regime change.
To be clear, as the New York Times puts it, Iran's clerical and military establishment remain in control of the country. Its most hardline factions may even have emerged strengthened. That remains a little hard to follow. That is largely because everything this president has said about Iran, from the reason he chose to launch airstrikes to the actual war aims, is constantly changing, literally every day. As far as what's next, the Pentagon is reportedly preparing plans for weeks of potential ground operations in Iran. And the Wall Street Journal reports Trump is weighing whether to approve a military operation to retrieve hundreds of pounds of uranium from the country. In the meantime, here at home, regular gas is $3.99 a gallon. That's up $1 from a month ago. The global price of oil continues to rise, and American oil prices closed above $100 a barrel for the first time in almost 4 years. With that, let's bring in our leadoff panel, Luke Broadwater, Pulitzer Prize-winning White House correspondent for the New York Times, Daniela Diaz, a congressional reporter for Notice, and Susan Glasser, staff writer for The New Yorker. It is good to see you all. Luke, can you make heads or tails of this reporting from the Wall Street Journal, the president floating the possibility of ending the war without having opened the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, it would be in direct contradiction to what he just posted on Truth Social, that they have to open the strait immediately. But it isn't inconsistent with some of the things he's been saying and floating recently, which is trying to distance the United States of America from ownership of the problems in the strait, right? He's been saying, well, really, Japan and China, they really get their oil and their gasoline through the strait, or NATO needs to be involved, or Europe needs to be more involved. So he's been constantly trying to pass the buck for the problem of the strait, which the United States hasn't been able to solve so far, and is a direct outgrowth of our bombing campaign on Iran. So we've created this problem now with the attacks, and we're casting about trying to find someone else to blame for it.
I mean, it doesn't make sense because oil is in fact a global market. This is not going to alleviate pressure at the pump. I mean, are congressional Republicans going to carry his water on this idea of ending a war without having even gone back to where you were before you started it?
Fantastic question, Alicia, because I am old enough to remember just 2 weeks ago when nearly every single Republican voted against Democrats to restrict the powers that the U.S. has in Iran. But now we're hearing from some more conservative Republicans, namely, I'm thinking a conservative Eli Crane from Arizona, who is a veteran, who is starting to say if there are boots on the ground in Iran, this could be an issue for us. This is not something that conservatives signed up for when they were supporting Trump's America First established agenda. Now, while they largely have said in the past couple of weeks that they support what he's trying to do when it was a non-proliferation mission in Iran, obviously those goalposts are moving and they're starting to raise questions about what are the intentions here. We've seen Republicans and Democrats briefed on the Hill continuously in the last couple of weeks, but depending on whatever the administration does next, I think we could see some breakouts from Republicans and how they respond.
Susan Glasser, let's talk about what this administration is likely to do next, because in addition to this Wall Street Journal reporting, today we also saw the president talking about two diametrically opposed extremes, a peace deal and in the same breath destroying Iranian infrastructure. Your sense of which of those options is more palatable to this president?
Yeah, I mean, look, Donald Trump, to a certain extent, has created this dilemma and is now casting about, as Luke said, for somebody other than himself to blame for it. It's really notable that he continues to threaten Iran, not only with a continued bombing campaign or the potential of ground invasion, but with actual war crimes. And I think it's important to note for people that threatening to destroy the civilian infrastructure of Iran not only is a war crime, but is exactly the kind of thing that Russia has been doing over the last 4 years since its unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, which is systematically going after the civilian infrastructure of another country. That is a violation of the basic principles, the international law of war. And for the president of the United States, with no mandate from Congress or the American people to threaten war crimes against another country is something that shouldn't get lost in, the fog of all of the, crazy allegations he's making. I would also point out, Alicia, that part of the reason we're confused about what Donald Trump is going to do next is because his own Secretary of State came out soon after Donald Trump said he was going to do one thing in the war and said very different things. Marco Rubio said, not long after Donald Trump said there is regime change, Marco Rubio came out and said, yeah, well, it's still a pretty tough group of guys. I'm not sure we're going to be able to make a deal. I think people who know much more about the inner workings of the Islamic Republic than I do believe that not only is it a more radical and hardline version of the government that we're seeing as a result of the U.S. and Israeli strikes, but that it's also true that their maximalist demands and our maximalist demands are quite incompatible right now. The possibility of a negotiated peace, it strikes me as very unlikely. It is definitely more possible that Trump will simply walk away and paper it over by claiming some sort of victory. But again, can he do that with a supreme leader whose last name is Khamenei, same as the first one, and with the Strait of Hormuz closed as a result of his actions? Very hard to see how even Donald Trump can spin that into a victory. So we may be looking at a ground invasion for that reason.
I mean, Luke, it is easy to explain the delta between what you're hearing from the Secretary of State and from the president, in that the Secretary of State probably actually read the briefing memo and understands what our own intelligence community is saying about what's happening inside Iran.
Yeah, I mean, when you hear Marco Rubio talk about this war, it often makes sense what the administration is doing. There's like 3 clear points they're trying to achieve. If we just take out the Navy and we take out the ballistic missiles, then we can declare victory and get out. And then you hear Trump talk about it, and it's shifting goalposts by the minute, sometimes by the hour. He, at one point, says we need to have regime change. Then he's okay with leaving without even opening up the Strait of Hormuz. I do know that they're very sensitive in the administration about this timeline they put out at the beginning of the war, which was 4 to 6 weeks. We're at 30 days right now. So they're coming up on that pretty quickly. And the idea that they're going to send in ground troops or positioning themselves to send in ground troops shortly, that would completely blow up that timeline. There's no way you put in ground troops right now and get out in 2 weeks.
So in addition to the cost of life that we have already seen of our brave service members, the reality of having additional troops now stationed inside the region, there's reporting from Axios that Republicans are considering making health care cuts to pay billions for the Iran war.
I mean, where do you even start with this, Alicia? It's First of all, the process on Capitol Hill right now is Republicans are trying to pass another bill along partisan lines. Their goal is to try to fund DHS for 3 years. It would be included in this legislation known as budget reconciliation. They already did that with the One Big Beautiful Bill last summer. Now they're going to try to do it again. They're going to try to roll in health care cuts in this package to potentially try to offset costs that we're seeing in Iran, because they know that they probably can't pass a supplemental funding package. And it's already costing billions of dollars to have boots on the ground, if there are boots on the ground, or to at least have a military presence in the war in Iran, I should say. And Republicans are trying to figure out how they could fund this. And it also is really difficult for them when their whole idea is to cut spending, to cut back on our operations across the ocean. I mean, it's really going to be difficult to have this message to the American people and to square this. It seems facetious to talk about it when there's real people involved, but I mean, the midterms are important and it's going to affect them, and they are aware of that.
The midterms are important because it is one of the only checks that remains on their power, because they have otherwise ceded all of their power to this president.
Right. I mean, the idea that Donald Trump doesn't feel a need to go to Congress to get authorization, those are the representatives of the voters. Those are the people you're supposed to go to in lieu of going to the voters. So the midterms is really the first chance, since Congress hasn't weighed in on this, for the American people to have a say about this war.